So, the plan for today, as most of you know if you've attended my lectures before, I enjoy a very different style of lecturing known as open forum. That means I ask a lot of questions. I ask you to discover principles without me telling you them. The reason for that is I think you learn better that way, and also because, guess what? I'm not an expert in everything I talk about. I may sound like it, but hey, that's just me, right? The thing is, you are not going to have degree-level knowledge of every topic you are asked to debate or every topic you're asked to teach your debaters. So there's no point in me standing here and giving you a condensed course of 3 years of macroeconomic theory and a history of Adam Smith's The Wealth of the Nations and Friedrich Hayek's principles of spontaneous order. We're going to talk about all of those, but only in as much as they relate to arguments and debate. We're going to talk firstly about a definition. What do we mean by a free market? Principles of laissez-faire economics, and where we use that phrase elsewhere. But we're going to focus mainly on economy and economics. We're going to draw a contrast with things such as the command economy structure, the gift economy, and the subsistence structure, but I don't want you to worry too much about those. I'll go into those a little bit later on. We're then going to talk about what the free market is, how it's structured and how it works, the limits of government intervention and why that's important. Then we're going to get into the real meat of this. Why are free markets good? What they are useful for, the principles that they promote, and also the practical results that we derive from them. We're also going to look at why they are potentially bad things. Who disagrees with them in principle and theory, whether those disagreements are valid or not. And then we're going to look at what happens if the free market is left completely free. What are the dangers that can arise with an untrammeled free market? And then lastly, funnily enough, because of the motion you've just been given, we're going to look at why we don't let banks fail in a free market. Because that might be useful, you know, for the debate tomorrow. Okay, so let's get started then, very simply, with a definition of a free market. Who wants to tell me what a free market is? A very simple definition, just one sentence. Brendan.
A market that is completely independently controlled and not controlled by the state.
Absolutely. That's a pretty good definition. Well done. Doesn't need to be any more complex than that. A market completely uncontrolled by the state. We can even go further and say that the only control within the market is what?
Is in the practices.
Businesses, practices, demand. On a more basic level. Two individuals. One is a customer, and the other one is
merchant.
A merchant. Let's call them a buyer and a seller, because that's even easier. Yeah? So the only arrangement in terms of price is that essentially of mutual consent between buyer and seller. That's what a free market is. The government has no interest in distorting the market by controlling supply, production, distribution, or maintenance of artificial market prices. We will talk a little bit about principles of protectionism and why they might be important within countries. Is everybody comfortable and aware of the term laissez-faire economics?
I don't know what it means.
Does anybody speak enough French to tell Brendan what laissez-faire means? Willis?
I don't know the direct translation, but where the government stays out of business.
Does anybody know the direct translation of the term laissez-faire?
Let them do.
Let do. Let do, that's it. It's that simple. Like most things, economists try to find words that other people go, not sure about that term, because then they can charge you money to explain what it means. The best people for doing this are lawyers. We learn Latin, so we can charge people $800 an hour. It's really good. But yeah, laissez-faire economics just means let do. It's the principle that, with certain exceptions, and there are usually certain exceptions in almost every economy, that the government should have no business in artificial regulation. What are the exceptions that most economies would accept?
On issues of child labor and wages.
Some economies would think that was important.
Monopoly regulations.
Some economies would think that was important.
Thanks.
Some economies would think that was important. I'm thinking about things that we don't always put out to the private sector. There's almost no country that does.
You know, we don't do all of our roads out to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Things that we think the state has to do and must do through taxation because they are for the equal benefit of all. Where they are for the equal benefit of all, we can't allow the market to decide for us what levels those should be priced at. Because the market might not decide on the right level or on the non-profit level that the state can decide on. So that would be things like law. And I don't mean in the sense of lawyers, obviously they are a private business. I mean in the sense of courts. We don't have a privatized court system. With the rare exception of quite distasteful dictatorships and juntas in Africa and South America, we don't like privatized armies. Defense tends to be an area where the state maintains its own monopoly. It's often said that one of the legitimacies of a state is dependent upon its monopoly on violence within that state. That if anybody else is allowed to exercise that right to violence, that undermines the state structure at the very beginning of it. So law and defense we can sort of put to one side. Road building is another one, although in many cases now road building is a purely private enterprise. It's paid for at a government level, but it's not performed or executed at a government level. We have other areas where we think we might be better off under state control, although there is a lot of debate about that. I come from a country where we are in a rush to privatise whatever we can. We privatised a railway system, forgetting that you can't run two different trains on the same bit of track at the same time. Anybody want to tell me why? Yeah, they're solid metal. They don't go past each other. So what you do when you privatise a railway system, 9 times out of 10, is you actively create regional monopolies. You then hope that the wider market of transport, whether people use the train or a different form of transport, is what will eventually regulate price. But that's not always the case. Healthcare is another area which in some countries is privatised. In a lot of countries they say we need to maintain a level of state control. Why is that? Sorry, someone else, Kate.
Because some people won't have access to actual healthcare when they're in need. Therefore, it won't be guaranteed such a fundamental things as treating them for fundamental illnesses. Right?
Yeah, it's about everybody having free and fair access to that healthcare. We are in a country right now which doesn't maintain governmental control over its healthcare, in which the healthcare system is almost entirely privatised. And what's the result of that? It sucks. In non-academic terms, I think, yes, it sucks is pretty fair. If you're poor, your healthcare is going to be poor. Or non-existent. I live in a country which still ostensibly has a system of healthcare which is free at the point of use. It's becoming less free at the point of use the more we introduce a profit motive. Now there's a distinction that we need to make in economic theory about stakeholders and shareholders in any industry. Shareholders are those whose interest is only in the economic capital produced by a business. Stakeholders may also be shareholders but are not necessarily. The stakeholders in a business are the ones who have an interest in seeing that business perform at its optimum level. Now there are some economic theorists, this is a little digression, who will say the optimum level is always decided by the private sector because the drive for profit will keep other costs down. Whether that's true when you have such a divorce between shareholder and stakeholder as in a privatized health service is questionable. If you have people whose only interest in the privatized health service is to make as much profit as possible, that necessarily impacts negatively upon the stakeholder whose interest is in getting the best healthcare possible at all times. That might be incredibly expensive, and if you're not ill when you're a shareholder, your interest is not in that patient at all. But that's a digression. That's got nothing to do with the principles of a free market economy. We also use the term in different areas. We use the idea of the market in debate. What do I mean when I say that? What phrase am I thinking of? Brenda?
Just the general economy, like if...
No, there's a phrase we use in debate. Why we say free speech is good, because it introduces ideas to
Marketplace. Of
the
it.
marketplace of ideas. Ideas themselves are in competition for our support. Free speech promotes this. So free market principles can be applied to philosophical arguments just as much as they can to tangible products. And that's important to remember. When we contrast our definition of a free market with the three other main forms of economy that exist, either in theory or in practice, we can see that there is a clear philosophical difference. What is a command economy?
If the people demand something, then the business will supply it.
No, not a demand, a command economy. A planned economy, if you will. Alex?
Where a central planning agency controls the allocation of resources.
Absolutely. And very often that central planning agency is who?
The government.
Government. Very much so.
Could I have
Decisions.
that in layman's terms?
Sorry?
Could I have that in layman's terms?
I'm going to give it to you in layman's terms now. I do that quite often. The command economy is one, you might want to note this down, in which decisions regarding production, distribution, and price are all within the control of the government. Now this may be for various reasons. They may wish to eliminate profit as a motive from that business, as in free healthcare for all. It may be that they wish to protect the workers of a certain industry. In the United States, there was a big move to protect the cotton industry when cheap cotton from overseas began to become imported and people started to lose their jobs. So we buffer economies by introducing tariffs on imports or by artificially subsidizing a certain area of the economy to introduce a level of protectionism. Don't always assume that protectionism is a bad thing. If you're one of the farm workers who derives benefit from the subsidy such that you can carry on farming as a way of life, you're probably going to be in favor of a level of protectionism. Do we have protectionism in the US? Yes,
Heavily.
we do. Even though we have the NAFTA agreement, the North American Free Trade Area Agreement. We also have, coincidentally, CAFTA, which is the Central American Free Trade Area Agreement, and the funniest one of all, LAFTA, the Latin American Free Trade Area Agreement. Seriously does exist. It is called LAFTA. In the EU, we have an element of protectionism in the European Union. We have something called the Common Agricultural Policy, which is an incredible piece of legislature that says, currently, that we should pay farmers not to grow food because there is too much. That is how the EU works. We were overproducing food, we had butter mountains, and we had wine lakes. We then dumped all our surplus food very cheaply on Africa. Nobody said, oh, aren't you wonderful, you lovely Europeans, giving away all these resources to those starving Africans. What we were doing was we were making the Africans pay for it, but making it at such a low price that there was no incentive for them to develop their agrarian economy, what they would grow and how they would sell it. So we harmed the development of other economies with our protectionist stance. As I've said, that doesn't mean that protectionism is always per se a bad thing. If you are protecting a certain industry that is vital to your economy because it represents a significant proportion of your GDP, what does GDP mean? Gross domestic product, exactly. Then you may have a legitimate claim to short-term protectionism. Finland is a very good example of this. Is everybody aware of a company called Nokia?
Yeah.
I would hope so in this day and age.
Yeah.
Nokia itself is responsible for over 40% of gross domestic product. Nokia is one of the world leaders in telecommunications. They haven't always been. They actually started out as a wood pulping firm in northern Finland. They then went on to make galvanized rubber boots. It wasn't until the 1950s, and Nokia has been around for about 100 years longer than that, that they got into technology through televisions and fridges. If you go to Finland, almost everything is branded Nokia. And I wouldn't try to walk around with a Sony Ericsson phone, because that's Swedish and they don't like that sort of thing. But because it represents so much of the GDP of Finland, a lot of people would say there is more legitimacy in, if necessary, the Finnish government applying tariffs on telecommunications products to protect that element of its GDP. Because without Nokia, Finland overnight becomes a third world country. That's the level of economy we're talking about, okay? Good. Gift economy. Can anybody tell me what a gift economy is? Brendan?
People just give things.
Yeah. It does exactly what it says on the tin, as we say in England. People just give things with no concept of quid pro quo. Quid pro quo, what's that Latin for?
Like something obviously
One for one?
Something for something. Something for something, literally. But as I've told you before, all Latin phrases mean, I speak Latin, you don't, that will be $800, please. So goods given without a concept of quid pro quo. They may, in certain economies, be an emphasis on social or intangible benefit in tandem with the giving. The more you give, the more you will receive of an intangible goodness. Somebody give me an example of an intangible goodness associated with giving. All right, okay. Ali.
Yeah, the way you feel when you know you've helped someone.
Yeah.
You feel good.
A sense of altruism is an intangible benefit. On a more practical level, but still an intangible benefit, karma. Does everybody understand the concept of karma? What goes around comes around. Do good and you will have good done unto you. Because of the mystic balance in the cosmos, the yin and yang, the male and female, always inherently indivisible and balanced. It may be social standing that increases. It may even be, in extreme forms of the gift economy, a sense of reciprocal altruism, that recurrent giving is used as a means of distribution of resources, without getting to the level of a barter economy, which takes us back into the realm of a market economy. So you may have the man who is good with his hands at making things, giving what he has made to the man who is good at growing wheat. The man who is good at growing wheat may turn that into bread and give it to the man who is good at hunting. The man who is good at hunting may accept the bread and decide to give some of what he has hunted to the man who is good at making the pots in which we cook it. But without any sense of bartering of the true value of certain products. Yes, Kate?
Isn't it the stage of economy that was here before we actually invented money or some standard to cover the commodities? Like, you know,
Almost. We're going to get to that now. There was a type of economy before money or currency, because we shouldn't talk about currency just in terms of money, because that will lead us into false distinctions between cash economies and barter economies. Before currency was ever a dominant construct in economics, what type of economy did we have? It wasn't quite a gift economy.
exchange economy.
It wasn't an exchange economy.
Ocean economy?
Some of them still exist, principally in Papua New Guinea and French Polynesia. That doesn't help much, does it? Oh, yes, of course, the economy of French Polynesia, I know that immediately. No. Subsistence economy is what I'm referring to, ladies and gentlemen. Subsistence economy. An economy that deliberately attempts to produce no more in a given period than needs to be consumed within that given period by a given population. It deliberately abhors the accumulation of product as both wasteful of effort and resource. Now it's clear why this was a dominant form of economy before things like electricity. Why is that?
If you had too much food, it would go bad.
Yes. We didn't have storage for food that we couldn't eat, so it would go off. We didn't have a concept of trading food with our neighbours because they grew their own. So almost all economies started off as subsistence economies. It's only later that they moved through the gift stage, and they moved through that very quickly from a concept of reciprocal altruism into a barter system. And that was the first currency. The first currency was somebody else's good. 1 apple is worth 2 oranges, 2 oranges, 4 bananas, and so on. What was the first thing that was used as currency that wasn't itself a good that could be used?
Shells?
Probably shells, yeah. Different things at different times. Sometimes spices were worth more than the money that was paid for them. Black pepper was once known as the king of spices because it was literally worth more than its weight in gold. Salt was an incredibly scarce resource at one time and was very much in demand by certain cultures. So it was used as a currency. Anything that you can make people desire will be useful as a currency. Pebbles that you find on the beach are probably not going to be that useful as money. Because any time I need to go to the bank, I can just go down to the beach and go, ooh, I'm rich. And I can carry them back. And there's no great limit on the number of pebbles washing up on the beach. Shiny metals, on the other hand, and let's face it, the humans are very close to magpies in that we're very distracted easily by, oh, shiny. Shiny metals, if they're hard to get out of the ground, very, very quickly become desirable and precious. The concept of a precious metal is itself part of a barter economy. There isn't much of it, and lots of people would like it. Okay, so that's a little bit about the command economy, the gift economy, and the subsistence economy, the three other major types of economy that we contrast with the free market. Let's get back to this idea of a purely free market. We said that it is price arranged by mutual consent of buyers and sellers and nothing more. But how true is that in practice? Do you, when you go into a shop, say, hello, Mr. Shopkeeper, I thought I'd come and discuss with you the price that you should set today for all the goods in your shop. And when we've reached mutual consent, we'll effect some sort of transaction. I'll give you a small token of whatever it is we're going to call money this week, and then I'll go off with some of your goods. Is that what you do?
No.
No. I mean, I'd be amazed if you actually spoke that many words when you went into a shop. But even in principle, that's not what we do. So who decides what price goes on the goods in the shop? The seller. He is almost in complete control of that in a true market economy. The buyer, on the other hand, has another freedom. If the seller has the entire freedom of setting the price, what is the buyer's freedom?
He chooses whether to buy it or not.
He chooses whether to buy or not. And in a wider market, he also chooses who to buy from. Exactly. So we need to perhaps modify our idea of price arranged by mutual consent into one that is more controlled by externalities. Externalities exist only in economics. They are things affecting third parties which then have an effect on you. Pollution, for example, is an externality on business. But externalities come into play. The two externalities that we need to consider most when we consider prices being set and the freedom of the buyer to go elsewhere are what? Somebody said it earlier.
Supply and demand.
Exactly. Well done, Brendan. Have a gold star. I mean that. You're doing really well this evening. Supply and demand. The law of supply and demand, as it's sometimes known. Not a law in the true sense. You can't be taken to court for there being no supply or no demand. But it's a law in the sense that the laws of physics are laws. When supply goes up, what happens? Or when demand goes up, what happens to price?
No, it goes down.
When demand goes up,
Oh, that's
price will also go up. Because when demand goes up, generally speaking, the supply decreases, unless we do something artificial to that supply source. So we first have to consider principles without any artificial intervention, and then look at how they work after that intervention. Price does not denote what something is worth. That is the first law of economics that you should know. Something is only worth what the buyer is willing to pay for it. I could slap a price tag on this chair, right here, right now. Let's say I'm going to put a $5,000 price tag on that chair. Anybody want to buy it? Really? It's a great chair. It's fantastic. Look, you can sit on it and everything, and it works. It doesn't collapse. $5,000. Anyone? Why does nobody want to buy my chair?
Very expensive.
Very expensive.
there's no reason for it being that.
But is $5,000 that expensive? To a millionaire, $5,000 is almost nothing. To most British people these days, $5,000 is very little. But that's more to do with exchange rates than free market economies. It's because none of you believe that parting with your $5,000 is a good idea if this is all you're going to get back. You know that if you go somewhere else with $5,000, you can get a lot of chairs that look like that. Or you can get a really, really good chair. I think they're called lazy boys. They're big leather recliners with a small fridge in the side to keep your beer or your soda in. I seem to remember Joey in Friends being very happy with one. So price, all it does is help to quantify value to consumers. The market dictates that the price will automatically reach a level at which consumers are happy to buy. If you maintain too high a price, nobody will buy your product. Strangely, and because of the weird psychological makeup of most human beings, set your price too low and nobody will buy your product either. That's an element of economics that we know as freakonomics. Has anybody ever read a book called Freakonomics?
I've heard it.
Good man, Andrew. Good book? Very good. Fantastic book. They did an experiment at a high school, and I believe it was in California, to see what would be the effect on people. They made lemonade, as high school kids do. Well, did in my day. I doubt very few make it today. And they set up 2 stalls with exactly the same lemonade. On one stall, they sold the lemonade for 25 cents a cup. In the other stall, they gave away the lemonade for free. Who was more successful? Who's got rid of most lemonade?
25 cents.
The people charging 25 cents. Why?
It's suspicious when somebody giving off just living there. I would think that it's something wrong with the lemonade. I'm trying to get rid of it.
Absolutely. Most people go, but I've been raised to believe there's no such thing as a free lunch or even a free glass of lemonade, so no, I don't trust you with your free lemonade. What are you after? Have you put something, some mind control substance in your lemonade? That's why you're so eager for me to take it? It's like the desperate salesman. I'm trying to think of his name. He crops up in lots of Simpsons episodes. I think his name's Gil.
Mm-hmm.
Why can't Gil get a break? And in one episode, he actually becomes successful by moving away from Springfield and becomes a real estate salesman. And he's really, really successful because it's all about the confidence in the seller that you have in his product. And then Marge walks in and berates him for the way he lived off them for months. And he collapses in front of everybody. And everybody's like, he's not amazing, he's just like us. And it's wonderful the way it illustrates that people buy things not because they've actually assessed the worth of something, but because it reflects what they feel is the value of it. Through competition, price should go down and quality should increase. This is another basic law of economics. Why would that happen?
Because if there's more competition, people like for example the quote unquote console wars with the game industry. If say Microsoft comes out with the Xbox 360, then then Sony's gonna say we got to compete with that, so everyone doesn't just buy an Xbox. We're gonna come out with PS3, and Nintendo says, well, we got to compete with them.
But what's to stop Microsoft phoning up Sony and going, Sony, got a deal for you, mate. We've got this thing called the Xbox, right? It's really good, but we don't want to give it away for nothing. You've got this PS3, why don't we both set the price at the same level, eh? Kushti. Why can't they do that?
Because we have a lot to cover the cartel, this is the first thing, and about the improvement, like take, for example, open source software we have.
Before we get into laws about cartels and price fixing, there is a principle that says that the market itself will not allow the cartel to operate. And that's because the free market, and this is one of the other characteristics of it, prevents the lowest barrier to entry possible into a market for a new starter. Okay? Because there is so little government intervention, there is so little overarching regulation, there is also an attendant lack of bureaucracy in the market. That means it's very easy for new players to enter that market. They can get access to the technology they need to compete on a similar level. That was seen particularly in the early 1980s, in the boom era of home computers. Commodore and Atari had almost cornered the market. And a chap from England called Alan Michael Sugar created a company called Amstrad, AMS Trading, Alan Michael Sugar Trading, Amstrad. And he brought in computers, home computers, at a very affordable price. There was a suspicion back then that Atari and Commodore were operating a form of cartel. Nobody could actually prove it. It's very difficult to prove the existence of price fixing. But it didn't matter. Because there was a low barrier to entry, which is a principle of the free market, it allowed another player to come in who just said, you know what, I don't want to be part of your cartel because I want to make computers that people can afford. So there is a self-contained protection against that. So the more competition we have, the price should go down, the quality should go up. The price decrease that we estimate has happened year on year due to mass production of products, averaged out across all industry sectors, comes to somewhere between 20 and 30% per annum since the 1960s, which is phenomenal when you think about it. But what you can do right now on a $500 computer, it would have needed a multi-million-dollar computer in the 1960s to perform those same functions. That's partially to do with demand. As demand increases, we can increase production. When we increase production, we start to deal in what are known as economies of scale. Does anybody want to explain what economies of scale are? Andrew, if you buy 100 t-shirts and one t-shirt is $1, would you expect to pay $100 for 100 t-shirts in one go?
Buying in bulk should be impressive.
There you go, that's economies of scale. Buying in bulk. The larger the quantity of the raw material you purchase, it should drive down the individual unit price. That makes the overall production of the unit much cheaper. And normally, if I keep saying normally, we pass on the benefits to the consumer at the end. So the free market then seems like a wonderful place. And it should just be left untrammeled to operate as it does. And we won't get into any difficulties at all. That'd be great, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it?
Yeah, if it worked.
If it worked. Why doesn't it work, Ethan?
I don't know.
Because then when you do that, then what ends up happening is that certain companies one company starts buying up all these other smaller companies, and eventually you get a huge market controlled by a few people,
Yeah.
which hurts competition.
Either by force or by fraud, the nature of the pluralistic market is that we'll always tend towards the monopolistic market. Now, what does that mean? That means that where you have many and the market itself demands efficiency, some of those companies will naturally start to fall by the wayside. They can either be subsumed into the larger companies or simply disregarded from the market. What happens is you will tend towards monopolization. You will tend towards there being one large company that always provides that product at the best price for the best quality. But if that's the case, what's the problem?
Once it reduces competition, there's no incentive for it to keep its quality up and the price down.
Once it gets to that state of monopolization, or to just a few businesses working very happily in tandem, all the benefits of our free market cease to exist. So laissez-faire economics say we maybe should have a little bit of regulation. We're going to hold our hands up and go, well, you know, maybe, just because human beings aren't as nice as we'd like to think, a little check and balance on them might not be the worst thing in the world. But we limit the amount of regulation because we want to allow the market to work as far as it can. So we limit the regulation to being against force or fraud, unfair business practices, false accounting practices, false marketing or false advertising to make people think your product is better when perhaps it isn't. But those are the limits that the laissez-faire economist says we should set. That's fine, he says. Have those checks and balances, but nothing further than that. Anything further than that, I'm going to call illegitimate intervention. There is an economist who we know as the anarcho-capitalist. Now, some of you will have heard the term anarcho as a prefix before. What does it refer to?
Anarchy.
Anarchy. The principle of anarchy is the same as the principle of liberty, that the individual should be allowed to decide for themselves what is good and what is not. But also, as a correlative to that, the individual should always be made to take full responsibility for their actions. Now that seems pretty fair in principle, doesn't it?
Yes.
It does. The anarcho-capitalist says, in fact, the market is so good at self-regulation, we shouldn't even have taxation. Taxation is itself an unjustified intervention in market forces. The anarcho-capitalist says, we don't even need the state to control defense and the law. We can privatize the court system. We can have individual arbitration agencies that deal with the court issues. We can have private defense contractors, mercenaries, if you like, soldiers of fortune, literally of fortune sometimes, or soldiers of fortunes, depending on who's paying them. But that's the anarcho-capitalist, which even most laissez-faire economists would say, you guys, you're kind of out here in left field right now. That's going a little bit far. Most economists would say, no taxation, we're okay with, as long as it's at its lowest level possible. What they call the principle of subsidiarity. We should govern at the lowest level possible, that closest to the people, at which the government is effective. Similarly, taxation should be set at its lowest level possible in order to be effective. So we should only garner enough tax that allows us to achieve what we consider our societal aims. Now, based on your societal aims, you might decide that different levels of tax are appropriate. If you are a social democracy, as per most of Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, I'm going to include Finland in that, even though geographically it's not Scandinavia, but politically and economically it is, they have quite high levels of income tax. They use income tax as a redistributive wealth mechanism to equalize the income within a society. Not to the extent of a communist structure, but to an extent that everybody deserves to live at a certain standard, and the ultra-rich benefit from the workers in a way that is intangible and therefore should be made to pay. The other end of it, you have systems like the US, where taxation is, compared to most European countries, quite low, certainly as an income tax level. The individual is expected to manage their own economy far more, and is therefore made responsible for things like paying for health insurance and things like that. There is nothing in either system to say one is always better than the other. It is only by looking at the produced results of either system that we can make judgments for ourselves on which system we prefer. If you speak to most Europeans, they will say they prefer their system to the US system. Bizarrely, that's because they grew up in their system, and we all feel comfortable with what we know. Most people in the US, even the people who would describe themselves on the left, have a differing view of taxation. The US was founded partly because of taxation. What was the great slogan? Steve? The great slogan about taxation.
No taxation without representation.
Absolutely.
No
You don't get to
scrutiny.
govern us and still take our money. So taxation was tied in very much with the idea of political representation and democracy. That we will give the state money in return for a say in how that state is run. We don't mind ponying up for, the army. We think that's probably a good idea. We don't mind giving a bit of cash for road building. We think, yeah, probably okay. But in return, we expect something back from you, the state. The other thing that was said by one of the founding fathers of this nation, one of my favorite men in history, I will be honest, a man called Thomas Jefferson. He said, tax evasion may very well be a crime, but tax avoidance is the duty of every right-thinking man. Because he felt that every man would naturally act in his own interest and by extension in the interests of those around him. Because by our nature we group together in tribes and families and villages and what have you. Because we recognize that some things are better done at a collective level than they are at an individual level. We are simply more effective sometimes working as a collective. Okay? If you take defense as an example, how effective would the defense of a country's borders be if every individual had to defend their little bit of the coastline?
Not very effective.
Not very effective. Centrally controlled armed force? Much more effective. It's okay, you don't have to be shy about stating the obvious. I like it. It's good. Okay. So the government intervention then, the free market says, should be limited to those areas of force and of fraud. We'll get on to cartels and things a little bit later. Now I want to talk about why, in general, both in principle and in practicality, the free market produces benefits for the society in which it operates. I want to talk about two principles, or three principles. First one is known as spontaneous order, which you might also have heard referred to as the invisible hand. The second one is the promotion of discovery. And the third is the punishment of inefficiency.
What was the second one?
Promotion of discovery. Spontaneous order and the invisible hand. What do we mean by spontaneous order? Even if you haven't heard the phrase in an economic sense, can you deduce what it might mean? Yes, Willis.
That the economy self-regulates itself.
To a certain degree, but it goes further than that. It's a phrase that was coined by an economist known as Friedrich Hayek, H-A-Y-E-K, quite modern economist, certainly 20th century. He presents the classic liberalist view. That sounds a little bit odd, doesn't it? Classic liberalist from a modern economist. But this is how it is referred to, the classic liberalist view. He says, within the free market, there is always more efficient allocation of societal resources than in any designed economy.
Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah. There is always more efficient allocation of societal resources than in any designed economy. What does he mean when he says that? Kate.
That the actual producing, let's say, corresponds with actual demand, or if it's already cheap, then there we have a regulation of prices and supply, so actually it will level out and satisfy the demand, or if the demand is too low, then it will bring also down the price of the food. It's also a level out.
Absolutely. Absolutely right. It's a principle that has a parallel in physics. Nature abhors a vacuum. The market will expand to fill the gaps that are there. And it will only expand insofar as it will fill those gaps, because any further expansion of the market isn't in its own interest. So people don't enter a market that is already flooded. People will fill a gap in the market. This can be expressed by the French maxim que le marché décide, which bizarrely, for the French, goes against every principle of economics the French have ever come up with. They're very great believers in a statist economy. But they do like their maxims, and they're very, very good at them, so I use them quite often. Yes, what Hayek is saying is that no matter how well you plan the allocation of resources across a society, the market is always more efficient at doing that. Because the market recognizes more quickly where it needs to expand, and because of financial constraints, when markets are full, it becomes obvious very quickly, and there's no more entry into that area. So we don't have superfluous business within our markets. Similarly, we have exactly the right level of provision of services. That's what Hayek argues. Do we believe that that is actually the case? Why not?
Because there are many people that don't get the services they need just because of having the right to them. such thing as a right level of provision, since not all of the population or all of the members of the group receive them.
Well, that's possibly because the market hasn't finished expanding in that particular area yet. Couldn't that be the case? That it just hasn't done its job, or hasn't had the time to do its job?
Yeah, sure.
Or it might be that if that were true, the market would effectively eliminate the law of supply and demand at its end. Because supply and demand, in order for the efficient allocation of societal resources to be true, must always be more or less equal. Once you've reached a level where everything is equal, there is no longer a market in action in that sense. So perhaps Hayek's maxim is itself self-defeating. Maybe we need to look beyond Hayek's maxim for an understanding of what he means then. And this we can find in a gentleman whose name you will have heard reference to if you've ever come across the field of economics in any shape or form before. He was a Scottish gentleman writing at the time of the Enlightenment, and his name was Adam Smith. Raise your hand if you've heard the name Adam Smith before. Good. Who can tell me the title of his most famous work? Ethan.
The Wealth of Nations?
The Wealth of Nations. Have you read it?
No.
I recommend it wholeheartedly. It is a fabulous piece of writing. Particularly at the time when most economies, although capitalist by structure, were still controlled very much by governments. The protectionist attitudes of guilds of tradesmen, which were a form of trade union, but were more used for price protection and artificial market manipulation. The protectionist attitudes of companies that were agents of their governments exclusively. And this is illustrated in a term that we still use to refer to bureaucrats in government. Has anybody ever heard people referred to as mandarins in government?
I've heard Manchurian, not Mandarin.
No, mandarins. The East India Company was not a company at all. It was an extension of British government in Southeast Asia. It did all of the governance of Hong Kong and the Chinese opium trading areas that we won in the Opium Wars towards the end of the 18th century. The people who worked for it became so efficient at running the economy that the state effectively removed itself from that area. And so the civil service thereafter became known as mandarins, because they were based on the idea of a company that would run as a government. What Smith said in The Wealth of Nations is as follows. He said, the individual who intends only his own gain is led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of society more effectually than when he really intends to. That's similar to what Hayek said in terms of spontaneous order, that almost by accident we will fulfill a societal need and therefore a social good in Smith's eyes, even without intention or without planning. And very often we will surpass what we would have achieved with micro-planning of an economy. Are we more comfortable with the way Smith phrases it than with the way Hayek phrases it? Does it seem to allow for more flexibility and more rationale? I think it does. I think it's quite clear that he says, nor is it always the worse for society. He accepts implicitly that sometimes there may be a negative effect. And that's true, there sometimes may be. So Smith allowed himself that little bit more leeway than did Hayek when arguing the spontaneous order principle. He went on, and this is the phrase that most people know, if they do know The Wealth of Nations as a text. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the baker, or the candlestick maker that we expect our dinner, but from the fact that we offer him money for his goods. We appeal not to his sense of love of mankind, but to his naked self-interest. Adam Smith said, if all men act purely in their own self-interest, then that is always in the interest, or almost always in the interest, of the society in which they live. Because no man would recognize it as being in his interest to harm the interests of the wider group, of which he considers himself a part. But Adam Smith was also the first person to say, but left untrammeled, and what do I mean by untrammeled?
Like unregulated.
Unregulated. Like tram lines. Tram lines dictate where people go. And Adam Smith was writing at a time when electric trams were very common forms of transportation in towns. So if something is untrammeled, it is unchecked, it is undirected, it is uncontrolled. Okay? He said that left untrammeled, a group of butchers acting in their own self-interest may very well decide not to abide by a free market principle, but to fix a price amongst them. Now, we all know why that's bad, right?
They can start a monopoly within themselves, like
Yeah.
create one big group.
Or not even a monopoly, even worse than a monopoly. They could give us a fictional idea of there being a free market, of the laws of supply and demand actually working. But in reality, they're not. If all the butchers in the town decide they're going to sell steak at $40 a pound, and that's the only place you can buy steak, that's pretty tough. Particularly if all the alternatives to steak, such as a bit of pork or a bit of lamb, are also controlled by people who said, yeah, we're going to set a price like that too.
Be a vegetarian.
You could be a vegetarian, although I'd argue that in 1776 or 1760 that was a much more difficult proposition than it is today.
Yeah, I know.
The agrarian economy wasn't sufficiently developed that you could survive on turnips alone. And it would be a very, very boring diet as well. We didn't understand the nature of nutrition in the way we do today. But the issue is not whether you could become a vegetarian or not. The issue is the unfairness of practice and the fact that it violates the principles on which the market is essentially founded. So Smith said, well, we need regulation in the extreme. We need to prevent the creation of monopolies by organic process because it removes the incentive that allowed them to arise in the first place. That is, better quality at a lower price. He said you'll reach a stagnation and you'll never know whether you could have better quality at a lower price because there'll be nobody to discover that for you. He said in terms of a cartel, that's almost more dangerous than an organic monopoly arising. An organic monopoly is efficiency is regulating the market there. It's with a cartel that's actively working against the efficiency of the market. One question that I have. Why is there only one Monopolies Commission? Surely there should be more, just in principle. Never worked that one out. Okay, let's look at the second idea of why the free market is good. We've had this idea of spontaneous order and the invisible hand and the better allocation of resources. Now that may or may not be true. We need to examine that a little bit later. Look at this idea of promotion of discovery. Why does the free market promote invention, progress, or discovery? Andrew?
If you're acting in your self-interest, then doing any one of those three things will get you money, which will help you out more.
Yeah. Those three gain you what we call competitive advantage. If the market seems full, the only way you can get people to come to your store rather than the store down the road is by finding a way of producing that good more efficiently. So you can sell it at a lower price. Or you can produce a better quality of good. So you can sell it at a higher price, but you can still create a demand for it. Starbucks is an example of that. Starbucks showed that there was demand for the $3 cup of coffee. And then lots of other businesses sprang up selling really expensive gourmet coffee. Right now, we've got to a point where Starbucks is so big, it's having to close down some of its stores because they're only competing with other Starbucks. In Church Street, you've got a huge Starbucks, and then right across it, you've got 3 or 4 little independent coffee houses, one of which I think has the best name I've ever seen for a coffee shop. It's called Uncommon Grounds, which I think is wonderful. But the invention, progress, and discovery model is only pushed by a free market because of competitive advantage. Invention may allow you to produce a better product or may allow you to produce the same product more cheaply. It may also allow you to develop an entirely new product based on an earlier product. You could amend something and make it better. We see that all the time in, for example, the car market or the computer market, where one manufacturer develops a technology, maintains a monopoly on the production of that technology for a very short time, because sooner or later somebody's going to work out the code for it.
Like Apple.
Like Apple. The iPod was a revolutionary product when it came out. Its use of the technology was phenomenally good. Steve Jobs is an amazing, not just technical mind, but an amazing business mind. I recommend his autobiography for anybody who wants to go into business as a model of socially responsible business building. The way he treats his employees, the way Apple interacts with the environment. It's very, very progressive in that sense. But at the bottom end of it, you ask Steve Jobs what his motivating factor is, and he won't say coming up with cool gadgets. Steve Jobs likes making cash. And coming up with cool gadgets is a very, very quick way of making lots of cash. But the iPod has been so successful that we no longer need to buy, we have no longer a need to buy an Apple product. How many other iPod type players are there on the market?
Hundreds.
Hundreds. And almost every one is generically referred to as an iPod. The audio files you download to whichever system you have of recording digital material and playing it back is known as a podcast. That's only because most people store them on iPods. The word pod doesn't mean anything else except in science fiction films, like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the pod people. It's got nothing to do with Apple, seriously. I know Steve Jobs might seem scary, but he's not one of the body snatchers. That's not why they're called iPods, okay? They're not going to suck your soul out and turn into you the next day. But it's now got to the stage where almost any MP3 player people will refer to as an iPod. What Apple then had to do was take the iPod to the next level. The iPod originally was just effectively an MP3 player, although it wasn't playing MP3s. It was playing a slightly different format of digital recording. But what does an iPod do now?
Goes online.
Video, pictures.
Goes online, plays videos. There was a chap on the plane next to me, flying over from Amsterdam to Philadelphia, who was watching an entire season of Lost, stored on this tiny, slim little thing. Absolutely phenomenal. The iPhone has done to the mobile phone what the iPod did to the standard MP3 player. It's changed its very nature. So much so that LG have produced a phone called the Beauty. Samsung have produced 2 phones, one called the Soul and one called the Toco, which are designed to ape the functions of the iPod. The Samsung phones are absolutely fantastic. In user tests, they score far more highly than the iPhone. I bet you the iPhone will still outsell them though, because it's called the iPhone. And it's the original, one of those. But invention, progress, and discovery can only happen because markets appear full, and yet aren't. We need to stimulate and create further demand if we wish to drive that market forward, and that creates the invention. Has anybody ever heard the phrase, necessity is the mother of invention? When you need to invent something, you very often do, very quickly. Most people who have made it as inventors in the last 20 years will say, well, I was working in X industry and I noticed people kept asking, why isn't there a tool to do Y? I can imagine somebody working in a hotel around the turn of the 20th century, possibly under Escoffier, with 2 spoons trying to make melon balls and thinking, why isn't there a simple tool that could do this? You know, like a, I don't know, a melon baller or something like that. And then going away and inventing them. Lots of things have crossover invention appeal. Not all of them do. Don't buy into the myth. A lot of people will tell you that Teflon and non-stick frying pans were a product of the space race and the shuttle program. That's absolutely not true. Okay? A lot of people will tell you that it's not true. It was the other way round. Teflon developed a substance for non-stick frying pans that they then realized could be used on the heat-deflecting tiles of shuttles effecting re-entry. But very often in debates, particularly about the benefit of space exploration, somebody will stand up and say, the crossover benefits, look, we have non-stick frying pans. And the other way around.
And Velcro.
And Velcro does actually come from the space program. That was the other one I was going to mention. Okay? The other thing about non-stick frying pans is, what do they stick the non-stick stuff to so it doesn't come out of the frying pan?
The food.
No, metal.
No.
But it's non-stick.
Isn't it like electric?
Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. You're all too tired. Come on. Sometimes it's just a joke, people. Okay, the second element. The second element of competitive advantage. Guys, can you listen and discuss it later? Thank you. The second element of competitive advantage that operates in the free market is the idea that inefficiency is always punished. Bad businesses go to the wall, either because they are selling a poor product or because the business itself is poorly managed. Businesses go to the wall for different reasons. Consumer confidence in a business may change. Qantas does great business as an airline. Does anybody know why? Even for flights that aren't going to Australia, Qantas do really well.
Why?
Because they've had fewer crashes in their history than anybody else. And they advertise themselves on that fact. They got a huge boost after the Tom Cruise, Dustin Hoffman film, Rain Man. Have we seen Rain Man?
No.
Rain Man was Dustin Hoffman's character. His name was Raymond, and when Tom Cruise's younger brother was very little, he couldn't say Raymond. So he used to call him Rain Man, which is where the title of the movie comes from. And Rain Man, or Raymond, is autistic. And he's been left in the care of his brother, Tom Cruise, who's a bit of a wide boy, you know, a bit of a player, likes fast cars, nightclubs, that kind of life. Doesn't like having to take care of the person he sees as a burden, his mentally subnormal brother. And they're going to get on a plane because Tom Cruise works out that Rain Man, because he's autistic, if he drops a box of matches on the floor, Raymond can tell him exactly how many matches there are like that. Like most autistic people, he has an incredible gift in one area. And with Rain Man, it's mathematics and counting. So where's he going to take him on a plane? Las Vegas, to count cards in a casino. They get to the airport, and Raymond says, "Is it Qantas?" And Tom Cruise looks at him and says, "What? Is it Qantas? We're flying from Chicago to LA, to Las Vegas. Why is it? I'm only going to fly Qantas." Why? Only Qantas never crashed. At the time that was true. About a year after the movie came out, Qantas had its first ever airline crash. Yeah, unfortunate, but still, not a bad record. And in the film, the Raymond character makes his brother fly from Chicago to Sydney and then back into Las Vegas, because that's the only way they can do Chicago-Las Vegas, purely on a Qantas airline flight. But Qantas do very well out of that. Businesses that are socially responsible often do very well, irrespective of their product, or the quality of their product.
Ben and Jerry's.
Ben and Jerry's.
Google.
Google.
Apple.
Exactly. Corporate and social responsibility is becoming more of a feature for businesses these days. But it's only one of the ways that we now rate efficiency. Ultimately, the market will always punish what we see as inefficiency, no matter how we choose to define that inefficiency. It's not the definition of efficiency that matters. In the olden days, in the mercantile economies, it was the quality of the manufacturing that sustained your business. Has everybody heard of the antique furniture Chesterfield? Or Chippendale? There were two furniture manufacturers from Britain. They are great pieces of furniture. They cost thousands and thousands of dollars now. But they were successful even in their time because they were known as master craftsmen. You can go back further to the age of the Caliph of the Ottoman Empire and the rugs that were produced in Istanbul. They were considered to be the finest in the world. Still are. They're referred to as Persian rugs. They come from nowhere near Persia, which is modern-day Iran. But one area of efficiency was the quality of your craftsmanship and your product. Another area of efficiency was setting prices effectively. If you set your price consistently too high, nobody is going to come and buy from you. And the last area I want to talk about in terms of efficiency, because this will take us on to the final part of tonight's lecture, is management can be itself inefficient. The management of a business should always make strategic decisions based on the long-term welfare of that business, but also taking into consideration the short-term concerns of the shareholders. Because as the CEO or as a director or a senior manager of a business, your liability is twofold, as is your responsibility. Your responsibility is to produce a dividend for shareholders at the end of the year, and also to make sure that your business remains at least as competitive from the start of the next financial year as you were at the start of this one. Your liability extends to due diligence, and what's the other one? Anybody know? Fiduciary concerns. Due diligence is a principle that says when making any business decision, you should act as if the money were your own, as carefully as if the money were your own. You are not playing with someone else's money so it doesn't matter. You don't get to gamble with the business's money and throw it away, based on the assumption that people are always careful with their own money. That's a nice idea, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anybody ever heard of the term rogue trader?
Yeah.
What's a rogue trader?
I don't know, but I've heard that word before.
Oh, right, okay. A rogue trader is somebody who chases their losses on the stock market, but they're not trading with their own funds. They're trading with the funds of an investment bank, somebody like Société Générale in Paris, or USB from Zurich, or Barings from London. Barings was a fine example. There was a chap called Nick Leasing who made some rather bad bets, because that's all stock market trading is. It's betting, it's gambling on financial markets. You could call it educated gambling, and people apply game theory, so I'm not sure how educated it really is. But it's gambling on the stock market. Nick Leasing bet lots and lots of money that the price of silver and copper in particular was going to increase, because he knew that this chap, Lakshmi Mittal, who was a steel magnate, was buying up lots of steel and copper as raw materials for his steel producing plants. He got it wrong. Lakshmi Mittal became so powerful in the steel industry, he is possibly the world's richest man right now. He's worth something in the region of 800 billion US dollars, which is a phenomenal amount. I can't even conceive of the number of zeros I now have to draw. But he got so much of the market that investors said there's no point investing anymore. So the price of those raw materials started to drop. Because Nick Leasing was what they call a futures trader, he was betting not on prices going up today and tomorrow, but in 6 and 12 months' time. Nick Leasing decided to chase those losses and get more of the bank's money and make bigger gambles to recover the money he'd already lost. Within 2 months, he went from a bad trading day of losing somewhere in the region of 20 million pounds, about 40 million US dollars at current rates, to losing 800 million pounds, $1.5 billion. And he bankrupted the oldest investment bank in Britain. They were bought for the princely sum of £1. when they finally sold because they had no cash to pay their debts. Kate.
Isn't this like a beginning of venture investment when you are trying to, when you're buying a things and you believe that you are going to return your money in the future?
Yeah, it is a little bit like venture capitalism. It's a little bit like venture capitalism. Venture capitalism is more when you go to people with money and a business plan and you could try to convince them to invest in you based on the return that they will get. Andrew?
Did they recover or are they just like gone?
No, Barings don't exist anymore.
Oh.
They were bought by a Dutch bank called ING, which also owns the ABN AMRO Bank, one of the biggest banks in the world now, along with the HSBC. But ultimately, that was because of financial inefficiency. There was bad management of what leasing was doing that allowed him to put the bank in such a position. And the market said, well, that's fine. That's what happens. You make bad business decisions, you close down. Or somebody comes in and buys you out who's been better at making decisions than you. And we know they're better at making decisions than you because they've still got all the cash. If that's the principle, and that's always the principle of the free market, what should we do with a bank like Bear Stearns, in principle, that makes so many bad business decisions, lending money to people who cannot afford to repay it, that they almost themselves go bankrupt? What should happen to that, in principle? They should go out of business. What did happen to Bear Stearns?
They got bought out by JP Morgan.
They got bought out by JP Morgan, but in the interim, what happened before that?
The government gave them money.
Government gave them money. Now, that's fine if you run a statist economy, and statist economies can be capitalist just as much as free market economies can. The Soviet economy was essentially a state capitalist economy. It was a very badly run one, but it was essentially a state capitalist economy. I make no judgment on the economic prowess of Mr. Khrushchev and Andropov and people like that. But I do think if you're going to throw money at an arms race you can't win, then you need to open up your markets a little bit to outside investment. But why didn't we allow Bear Stearns to go bust? Was it about Bear Stearns? Was it about the people who'd created that financial black hole that we thought they shouldn't be punished for bad business decisions, that somehow they should get rewarded for inefficient management?
No, it was because if...
Hang on.
It's not people's confidence in the government and the banks.
It's about people's confidence in the banks. More importantly, it's about people who have money in Bear Stearns that has got nothing to do with these bad debts. How do banks work? This is the important thing. Banks work by getting money from people on the promise that they will keep that money safe for you and possibly increase it through interest payments and the like. They then take that money out of the bank and put it over here and start playing games with it and gambling with it. But they always make sure that they have enough in reserve so that if one of their customers comes in to take their money, then they can. But they hope that's not going to happen. Because based on the idea that they keep making these interest payments and people keep seeing the return on their investment, they're happy to leave their money in that bank. When banking first started, it wasn't an industry in the way it is today. Has anybody ever heard of Wells Fargo?
Mm-hmm.
Very, very old bank. I don't know if it still exists, does it? It does.
Yeah.
God, aren't they doing well? But they were famous for being the bank in the Wild West in the days of, you know, cowboys and Gary Cooper, the man in black. Gosh, I am showing my age now. Gary Cooper's not that old.
He's awesome.
He is awesome, but I still think, yes, he is that old. Jack Nicklaus is awesome, but he's also quite old. Age is no barrier to awesomeness, as I think we've discovered this camp. Well, at least I have from the math kids. Go me. But in the old days, in the Wild West, people used to put their money in banks, not because the bank would invest it and give them a return on the investment, but because
They wanted a safe place to keep it.
it was safer. So the banks that could best maintain that security were the banks where more people would put their money. If the gang couldn't blow up the back wall of the bank and ride off with the safe, then you were going to be okay. But if that did happen to the bank in, let's say, Dodge, Arizona, was there any protection for the investors, or did they just lose their money?
They just lost their money.
They just lost their money. There was nobody to bail them out. Wells Fargo may have been able to make profit in other banks to say, we can help you out, but it depends on the nature of their business and on the size of their business at the time. There was no way of regaining that money, but what there was an immediate loss of consumer confidence in that individual bank. Nobody would go and put their money in it later, particularly if the robberies kept happening. And we're talking sort of a Butch and Sundance thing where they go and rob the same bank 3 times in a week, based on the principle that if you've robbed them once, everybody isn't super vigilant, they're now super relaxed because the chances of getting robbed twice in a week are really small, right? And Robert Leroy Parker, which is the real name of Butch Cassidy, worked out very quickly that the best time to rob a bank is the day after it's just been robbed, because nobody expects that. There might not be that much money in it, but there's also going to be no resistance. Okay. But in the modern day and age, banks do provide that security. They say, don't worry, even if we lose money over the course of the year, your money isn't affected. And we'll even guarantee you interest payments. If you put money into a savings account, you are told, aren't you, each year how much percent return you will get on your investment. What's the current savings rate in the US? Very small, 2%, 3%? Okay. We're doing better in the UK. We're anywhere between 8.5% and 10% on our savings accounts right now. My current account carries 8.5% actual earned rate interest. So our economy is not in a bad shape at all. And the bank I'm with is one of the biggest banks in the world. So even if they do lose the odd billion here or there because of rogue traders, I'm pretty confident they won't go under. We had a situation in the UK recently where a bank did go under because it got caught up in what they call the subprime mortgage scandal. And who's heard that term before? Nick, do you want to tell us what the subprime mortgage scandal is?
I just remember it being in the news. I don't really know.
Okay. Jacob, what's the subprime mortgage scandal?
It's when lending firms use predatory lending to give loans out to people that they can't pay.
It's called subprime because the prime market is the market you should aim at, the market with the best rate of investment and return. It's sensible lending, what they call socially responsible lending. You only lend as much money as people can afford to borrow. They have indicators that work this out for you. If you go and get a mortgage, I don't know what the rates are in the US, but there will certainly be some kind of calculation used, and it will be based on 4 times your annual salary, something like that. Or if 2 of you are buying a property together, then 4.5 times the combined salary, perhaps. That's a pretty standard way of calculating how much somebody can afford. When you take out a credit card, you tell them how much money you earn each month or in a year, and then they tell you what your credit limit is. And they won't give you a credit limit that they don't think you can pay off in 1 month if you want to. As you build up what we call credit scoring, then your credit limit will increase. If they give you a credit limit, let's say, of $5,000 on your first credit card, your minimum payment is going to be somewhere around, if your balance is full, somewhere around 5% of that total. Okay? So you might be expected to pay $100 a month. Now if you, for the first 6 months you use that credit card, put on $1,000 and clear it off completely, very soon the bank's going to say, well, you can afford to pay $1,000 a month. So we're going to adjust your credit limit so that even if your minimum payment is $1,000, we know you can make that. That's good business for the bank because they make money on the outstanding balance because they apply interest. And it's also good for you because the more credit you have, the more purchasing power as an individual you have. Subprime says, that's not the best way to do business. Best way to do business is look at the price of property going up. There's a massive boom. We're all going to get rich off the housing market. I know what we can do. Why don't we lend money to people we'd never normally lend to? Because the economy's doing so well, they're all going to get pay rises and everything will be fine. And even if they don't, we'll get a house. That'll be nice. Be nice for the bank. It's not very nice for the person who has to be thrown out of their property, though. And ultimately, when it comes down to it, courts aren't just made up of economists. So they have a really hard time telling people, get out of your property. So they're going to say to the banks, well, you should have thought about this before you lent this money. This is your job. You're the expert here. There's an imbalance of bargaining power when you form this contract with this person who doesn't even have a high school diploma. And you're talking about interest rates and things like that. You're baffling them with the science, and you're just saying, don't worry about it, have the money, we'll take care of the rest. And it creates a horrible situation. And if the courts aren't willing to enforce repossession orders or repayment orders, and are willing to wipe out some of the debt to alleviate the problems for these people, and there are firms now advertising, there was one on the television last night, saying if you owe more than $30,000 on your credit card, contact us and we'll arrange a deal for pennies on the dollar, and in 3 years, 36 months, they promise you can be debt-free. We have the same advertisements on English TV all the time because everybody is now being affected by the credit crunch. But we are still not going to let failing banks go to the wall. Because it's not just about their mismanagement. Yes, those individuals should be punished. And very often they're not. Very often they still walk away with their annual bonus. It might be a smaller bonus because the bank hasn't got that much money anymore, and they might move on to a different bank. But they're very rarely punished in the way we would expect. The bank itself needs to escape punishment because the money that should be in the bank isn't the bank's. It's yours and it's mine. It's money I might have put in there for my child's college fund. It's money that you might have put in there, Andrew, for your retirement plan. It's money that Steve might have saved up because, you know, he's planning a big wedding next year or something like that. All those savings matter to the individuals. So we have to find a way of providing a safety net for those individuals. That's one reason why, when banks go to the wall, we might step in and save them. There might be an interventionist policy. The second reason, sorry, Andrew.
I'm not going to address it later, but like, why don't we just let the banks go under and then pay them out of FDIC?
Ah, now that is what I am going to address. Why don't we just say to the bank, you know what, you've lost. We're going to shut you down, all your customers can go elsewhere, but those customers come to us with your savings books and we'll just pay you out of the Federal Reserve. You know, some kind of compensation fund. Most countries have them, for criminal injuries or something like that, where the person who's defrauded you is unable to make restitution. The state says, well, we understand, you've still suffered. You still deserve some of that cash back. Why don't we let that happen?
I'm just talking from my own experience because we have this foreign kind of criminal economy because we have these private companies lending over than they're actually owning, and they bankrupted, but the government actually said that they do not plan on paying it back, and actually they didn't have any contract with these persons. They do not have enough money at least.
Yeah. The reason we don't let the banks fail and then pay people out of reserve is more to do with confidence in the banking system. Not confidence in the market, because it undermines our confidence in the free market if we know that ailing businesses will be artificially propped up by the state. But confidence in the banking system is so important to the way our economies now work. If we don't have banks, what are we going to do? Revert to a barter economy straight away? That would be incredibly problematic. We'd have to reassess the value of every product. And in different areas, different values would apply. You'd have very staggered economies across regions and countries. That in itself would be harmful and detrimental to our ability to trade internationally. If the north of England, for example, things were worth different things to the south of England, then England as a whole can't trade very well with France. Most international trade is based on there being an understanding of an international monetary system. That might need protection at an artificial level. It might be one of those areas that we simply cannot leave to the free market to regulate itself because of the damage it does to the only influx we get into the banking market, which is more of your money. Other businesses, it's fine. We can let those go to the wall and customers can go elsewhere to a provider. But we see banking as such a homogenized industry that when one bank fails, it creates what we call a run on banks. And a run on banks, and this is where the economics gets slightly complicated, are we all aware that there isn't as much money in the world as people claim there is? Right. You can have 8 billion in the bank, you can have 8 billion in the bank, you can have 8 billion in the bank. That bank has not got 24 billion in it. Okay? It might have promises of money coming in, it might use some money to invest in other businesses in the hope that you will never all walk into the bank at the same time and say $8 billion, please. But if one bank fails and the government allows it to fail and it goes to the wall, people say, well, hang on, how is that bank different to that bank over there? How is the HSBC over here different to the First National over here? Because if everybody's queuing up at HSBC to get their money out, that doesn't just mean that there's a problem at HSBC. To most consumers, that sends the message that there is a problem within banking. Okay? So we then run to the First National across the road and all pull the money out of that. And then people at the Wells Fargo down the road go, you know what, I'm not leaving my money in here. You've seen what's happening up the road at First National and HSBC, I'm getting out. Everybody goes to the bank at the same time, and every bank, and says, where's my money? Almost none of that money is there. Most money these days is virtual. There simply isn't enough cash in the world for everybody to pull out of the bank at the same time. If that happens, then the entire banking system collapses. And given that our economy in most countries is built on some kind of capital, hence capitalism, that would have disastrous short-term effects for the world economy. We would be back to a system of grab what you can, in terms of land grabs by countries, wars to protect resources. What we now see is an isolated and immoral situation in Darfur, which is only a government trying to protect its natural resource of oil. That is the essential justification of the government in Khartoum prosecuting the genocide in southern Darfur, is that southern Darfur is the region of Sudan where all the oil reserves are. The rhetoric they use is that they are simply trying to secure the oil reserves for the future. Every country would then be in a state like that. Russia wouldn't have to go very far because it has most of the natural resources it needs. The oil and the gas and things like that. Yes, Willis?
If people started like doing bank runs, why not just take every amounts and cut them by a percentage so that the amount of money in the world is the amount of money that can be
So everybody gets pennies on the dollar.
I don't quite understand that statement, but I guess.
Well, instead of getting $1, I give you 40% of it, so 40
Yeah.
cents. What would people think if they were told everybody's getting less money than they put in? Would they understand that it's because most of the money was virtual?
No.
Or would they think that somebody somewhere has taken all my money?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Most people would react like that. So you risk instability and insurrection within
But it
the
would
wider
work.
society.
It would work aside from like
Well,
people being ignorant.
well, work is a relative term. There are practical objections as to why you couldn't do it, because of the reaction being so violent and leading to total instability and total insurrection. Alex.
Since these like bank runs have such catastrophic effects, how do you oppose governments
Right, that's the last question we need to deal with then. I'm going to try and deal with it very quickly, because I'm aware that I've been talking now for just over an hour and a half. Why then shouldn't governments intervene? This is where the principle comes back into play. The principle of the free market is nothing if it is not absolute. That is, laissez-faire economics cannot be run without exceptions, apart from those exceptions which we mentioned against force and fraud. There is nothing fraudulent or forceful about a bank making a bad business decision. By government stepping in to protect those banks, that alleviates the bankers from their corporate responsibility, from their due diligence obligations. I also mentioned fiduciary relationships. Fiduciary are simply relationships of trust. All bankers worldwide operate in a principle that's known in Latin as in uberimae fides, in utmost good faith. Fides is where we get the term fidel, faithful, from. In uberimae fides, in utmost good faith. If bankers know that they are not subject to the same laws of the market as other areas of the market, what incentive is there for bankers to operate in a responsible way with your money when they go and gamble? Will they then take unprecedented risks in terms of with whom they invest, what industries they invest in, what they promote, because they know that they're in a bubble economy, that it is not affected. That could have far-reaching consequences on the rest of the economy, consequences that we might not yet be able to predict. There's also an argument that says, well, hang on a minute. If you've said free market great for most businesses, not for banks, we need to maintain confidence in the banking system, but only because without confidence in the banking system, the entire capitalist economy falls, well, that means that capitalism itself might be slightly flawed as a system. Because you've created a system based on principles which you can't apply to the central business within that system, which is banks. So that might create just a whole logical inconsistency, that in order for capitalism to be sustained, we need to occasionally artificially prop it up, which means that it's probably not a good natural system. That is an argument that can be made. The argument against that is command economies are very often more inefficient than capitalist economies. They don't drive production, invention, and discovery, and so further the wider development of a society in the same way as the free market does. We might be prepared to accept a logical flaw within the system as a whole if it means wider benefits outside that economic system. Because we like discovery, because it makes the society we live in, not everything is done for profit, some things are accidental. But the fact that you and I are all sitting here, or standing here, talking and listening today, is because we are a product of the societies in which we have grown up. Those societies are themselves a product of investments made in earlier societies. I'm 35 years old right now. If I didn't live in a capitalist economy, I wouldn't be standing here, mainly because I'd be dead. Medicines follow that same model of progress, discovery, and innovation in the free market. The reason pharmaceutical companies develop better techniques to take care of people is because they are allowed to exercise a profit motive. Now, there is an argument to say that some people would always go into that kind of work and that area of research. But broadly, most people find it easier to say, if we incentivize people that they can achieve something for themselves, then they will do good for others. It goes back to Adam Smith's idea that the individual acting in his own self-interest will very often act in the interests of society, even if that's not his intention. So now do we see how we come full circle from the base of a free market principle, we go right through to a modern international banking economy when it brings us back to that same principle at the very beginning. Obviously, we can make arguments that say, well, no, we should just let failing banks go to the wall. It will make banking better. But are we willing to run the risk of the short-term crisis to safeguard what might be just a principle in the long term? That's the question you need to ask yourselves when you're having this debate. Thank you all very much for your attention. I apologize it's been so long. I think your attention has been fantastic. Well done.